I'm Paul McGowan. Let's get to today's question. And the mystery envelope, please. Well, let's see. This is always interesting because I don't know what is inside, and we'll hope it's an interesting one. All right. Bruce from Austin, Texas writes, if moving monoblocks close to your speakers in order to shorten speaker cable length, would using a lighter gauge cable have much impact? Say you go from a generic 10 gauge to a high quality 14 gauge, or would you always want as big a speaker cable gauge as budget allows? Oh boy. Well, the cable question. It's always a good one, and I hesitate to make any kind of definitive statements. From my own personal experience, bigger is better. The gauge of the wire for your speaker is important, but not as important as the construction. For example, in Music Room 1, we use a ribbon cable. It's a very wide, flat piece of Kapton tape with copper or silver plated onto it. It's actually like a foil. And the gauge of it is actually pretty light. So that's completely different than the original PS Audio speaker cables that we made, which had fairly heavy gauge wire. Some of the experiments that I started with when I began designing speaker cables involved differences in sound quality using a heavy gauge as opposed to a light gauge. So when I used a heavy gauge, say like a 10 gauge or a 12 gauge solid core, and I would use Romex, the stuff that your walls carry power through your house. And using just 10 gauge Romex versus, say, 14 gauge Romex made a heck of a difference to every speaker I hooked it up to in terms of bass, fullness, mid-bass, and richness. What was lacking was the top end. It was kind of, the heavier the gauge, the duller it got, and therefore we had to come up with sort of a smorgasbord or a sandwich to where we would add thinner gauge to the heavier gauge and come up with a multiple gauge cable. So I don't think there's any good definitive answer to your question. And it's a great question. I can just share with you what my experience has been. And in general, wimpy speaker cables, wimpy power cables, I hate to say it, they sound kind of wimpy. It's not always true. There are many different types of architectures, as I just explained, but that's generally what I've found in my years of experience. Thanks for the question.